In this episode, we discuss the 2014 movie Selma, which gets into a chapter of the civil rights movement where civil rights leaders, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., use nonviolent demonstrations against oppressive state and local officials in Alabama to successfully fight to end the rampant voter suppression that was going on at the time. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man who, once you hear his deep, booming voice, it's too late. He's got you. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show him that you feel good today?
Yes, sir. I guess, putting me in the likes of Barry White, I'm a little bit nervous, so.
Hey, I knew that you would, man. I knew that you would.
Listen, I'll save the audience from hearing me sing, okay? We want them to stay for the show, not leave right now.
Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you subscribe and like the show on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. We're recording on January 13th, 2026. And today we continue our Stream Between the Lines series and take a look at the movie Selma, which was released in 2014 and is currently available to stream, at various services. It's directed by Ava DuVernay, and the movie highlights a period which preceded the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and allows us to see the roles played by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders, also key American political leaders, and the American people from many different persuasions, and see their roles in this moral and political battle that was going on in this period in American history. So, Tunde, I want to jump in, to get started. First, we'll look at, kind of the characters and, Dr. King and the civil rights leaders. So what stood out to you about the portrayal of Martin Luther King or the civil rights movement in general and their leaders and so forth in the movie?
Several things stood out, man, but I would say the first thing was, the complexity of the relationships, number one, between people like himself and Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president of the United States at the time.
Yeah.
And then also, I would
he had a community, like he would meet this guy, it seemed like regularly, meet with him and, just like that was interesting to see.
Yeah. And, a few of the other characters, but I think those two I'll start with. And then I'd say for King himself, just watching a movie, I guess, made me appreciate this more than, I guess, other things I've watched about him, was just thinking the idea that he was just, besides being Martin Luther King, the civil rights icon and the preacher and all that, he was also just a regular dude. Like, he had a wife, he had kids, and he's dealing with all this. And, and I'm thinking I'm older than he was back then. Remember, he was 39 when he was assassinated.
Yeah. He's 35, 36 in this time. That was when.
Yeah, exactly. So he's in his mid 30s. Here I am in my late 40s. And I'm thinking, man, this guy had a lot of pressure on him. You know what I mean? Because it's just, no, on a serious note.
I agree. Like, he had the civil rights movement. Yeah. He had family stuff he's trying to deal with, too.
And to know that, his house was firebombed, things like that. And then, guys like you and I are parents who think about how this kind of struggle, and you said it in the windup for this discussion today, which is he was asking for access to the ballot box. Really, that's what this was all about.
This period was about that, because the civil rights act had already been
legal
passed.
Right.
Yeah,
correct. Like, we're citizens of this country, and we're trying to vote, and they're not letting us vote in the South. And it's just this basic appeal for just being recognized as an equal human. And it led to all this other stuff, and this national stuff. And then the last I'll say and hand it back is the way that they brought in periodically the reminder that he was constantly under surveillance. Yeah. That stuck out to me, too. I was just thinking, man, like, you're dealing with all this stuff. And then you have literally the United States government and the FBI actively trying to just, run interference on your marriage, all this stuff. Yeah, but I was just thinking, like you said, he's a 35-year-old guy juggling all this stuff. And that kind of is what the movie made me appreciate, I guess, in ways that documentaries and other things just didn't.
Yeah. I mean, because the way it's presented to you, even when if you hear audio from that time, like you hear him speak and he has the preacher speak, and it sounds like an older person for sure. Like seeing and really driving home, like, oh, this is mid 30s, like mid-30s person leading this thing, and then, like you said, had just normal life stuff too, and then all of the stuff that, because he's leading it, brings to it's coming into his life as well. Yeah, that stood out to me as well. The thing, the parallel I really saw in this, and it really jumped off the screen to me, is that the civil rights leaders and Dr. King and the civil rights leaders, and then also the people that are involved in the movement, they really reminded me a lot of like the American colonists, the people who started the Revolutionary War. And it really, because they're putting their bodies on the line, their lives on the line here to go against an oppressive state to try to get freedom. And so like it's not like this isn't some highbrow debates, and there are court cases going on and stuff like that, but the real movement that happens is because people are out there in the street together standing up against oppression, which is how we look at the American Revolution. It took a Revolutionary War to get that oppression off of the American people. So seeing the civil rights movement people as like as akin to the founding fathers and the people who were around and were not the loyalists, at the time of the American Revolution, but the people who were on the side of trying to get freedom. It really seemed very similar to me, because it wasn't. They weren't a military force. They were opposed by, just like the American colonists were opposed by the British military. They're opposed by a militarized state officials, local officials and so forth, and the police and all that stuff. But that wasn't them. These were just people, and they were like, hey, we just have to go through this in order to get freedom. And, to see what they laid on the line and how steeled they were, how serious these people were, is to know, hey, we're walking into this thing. They're going to crack heads, and the heads they're going to crack are ours, but we have to do this in order to move the ball forward. I mean, it's really admirable and impressive, to look at that and to see, like, they weren't like, oh yeah, la, we're gonna do and everything is gonna work out for us. It's like no, they're like, yo, we're doing the hard work, and in the same way, the outcome's uncertain in the same way it was, at the time of the American Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great comparison to the American Revolution and the spirit of the Patriots at that time, because you're right. At the end, it is about hierarchy. It's about authoritarianism. It's about throwing off the yoke of someone who's got their boot on your neck, in a sense. That's where I think it's interesting the way you say that, because within our culture, made me realize that we're all taught to revere the Patriots, the Revolutionary War, that period of Americans who revolted against the king and overthrew the British forces to create this country. But we're still debating whether someone like Martin Luther King is allowed to be seen as an equal type of American hero in the story of, I wouldn't even just say equality. I would just say the American story.
The American story.
Because
and I mean, I would say the debate was had in the 1980s. Like the people who want to put him at that level won, because he has a national holiday, and like President's Day, there aren't just other, bunch of other figures that have their birthday as a holiday. So he has been elevated, but I would agree with you that oftentimes it'll seem like these things are tiered in a way, or that people may be pulling the wrong lessons as far as why we're revering the colonists, the American. Yeah. Why are we revealing these people? Are we revealing them because they stood against tyranny, and like that we as Americans want to stand against tyranny, or were they revering them for something else? But
let me jump on that real quick, because you make let me just say this though, because you make a very important point there, which is that the way that the story is told is also about who's allowed to be included and who's not. And I think that is because, as you say, that those forces kind of won in the 80s, we're living through now the same type of energy that didn't want Dr. King to succeed has come back and reared its head publicly. And
that's why I want to get to the next section, because in the next section of this conversation, though, I want to ask you about, like, the movie did a lot, like the movie wasn't just following Dr. King around, like we also were shown, like LBJ, we were shown, George Wallace, governor of Alabama at the time, and their interactions, their conversations, what they're trying to do. And then they're having political calculations. They're having moral calculations and so forth. So What about the portrayal of key American political leaders, and also the portrayal of various segments of American people? As we saw through this, you had obviously the portrayal of the people who were part of the civil rights movement, but we saw during the course of the movie more people were joining that, at least in terms of what was happening in Selma. But then also the leadership. So you could take that in a different direction. But I did want to get to this in particular in terms of beyond just the civil rights leaders. Like what else stood out to you in far as maybe general American people or American political leaders?
Well, what actually stood out to me, man, was the fact that I think a lot of the rhetoric we heard in supporting segregation by those who wanted to support it, and the way that they, kind of projected a negative, I would say, pejorative type of language onto the people who wanted integration. It reminds me again a lot of the culture wars today. That was a part of the reminder of me watching this whole thing, was that we are still living, that was 61 years ago. We're in 2026. But the baby boom generation is still a big block of people, and we're still living in the cultural shadows of the civil rights era. And these fights, what is the role of the federal government? This is when the whole thing of the Southerners wanting states' rights a little bit more than they had before, and this rhetoric that the federal government is the problem. And a lot of that was taken in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan, because it was energy that they used politically to deal with the Southerners who didn't like the changes that were brought about by the movie, what we saw in the civil rights era. So I think that, calling people who wanted integration communists, and today we see people who want equality being called socialist, communists, this always making it out like it's a problem to bring people together. And the need for some people in our society to maintain a caste system, because really that's what the United States had prior to 1965, was a legal caste system where Black Americans were the bottom caste legally. They were unable, and this is things that they brought up in the movie, unable to serve on juries, unable to do this, do that legally. So I think that...
And remember, this is after the right to vote is enshrined in the Constitution, back in the 1800s. And so all of this was happening through the legislative process and the administrative process through government officials, the denial of the right to vote. And that's what the Voting Rights Act was about, which interestingly enough is being dismantled and has been dismantled by the current Supreme Court and many actors today. But in order to stop people from using the legislative process to make it so difficult for people, or to make arbitrarily throw them off the rolls, or to do these different things to make it so practically they couldn't vote. That's what the Voting Rights Act was about. Yeah. The right to vote was already enshrined in the Constitution, but people use these state and local laws and actions in order to prevent it functionally from happening. So, you see how that had to be addressed legislatively. And then it was, and then then the voting block changes, but you see this kind of, as you said, we're kind of in this blowback period where right now, over the last 15 years, we're seeing voting right pieces and pieces of the Voting Rights Act being chipped away persistently by the Supreme Court and so forth, and again, other actors in states wanting to make these laws, and then they get challenged, or they say, hey, this violates the Voting Rights Act, and then the law gets to go through, and you chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. So to me, yes, the pushback that you see, or that we may be living through right now, is something we're seeing in this instance. We're seeing the status quo being something different, and the push going one direction. And then we're kind of living now where the status quo is where that push went to, and it's getting pushed back. Backlash is real, and it's a real part of the American story when you look at, like the historical stuff. For me, I'd say the thing that stood out the most. Let me get to this, because I want to throw this back to you anyway. What stood out to me the most is, this is my understanding of the history as well, but the movie made this point very explicitly. It's like, you have the local governments in Alabama, you have the state government in Alabama on one side, and that's on the side of, hey, we need to oppress these people, we need to beat these people, we need to, like, all types of crazy stuff, like the state needs to show up and put hands on people to keep them in their place, and to stop them from demonstrating, to stop them from doing anything. So you had the state governments doing that, state and local governments. Then you had the federal government, more of a top level view, saying, deciding how much it's going to intervene in order to stop the state governments from going buck wild like that. And what really flipped me out, and it's kind of like this thing of where the status quo is kind of flipped, what I was just talking about before, is how now it almost feels like in our modern society, the federal government is the one that wants to go out and put hands on people. And, we've seen instances, where the federal agents have shot people now, unarmed people, which in that case, back in the 1960s, we're seeing state governments, state or local officials shoot people, unarmed people and so forth. So, and then saying it's justified. And then the feds, the feds then were the white knight, so to speak, saying, oh, whoa, you guys are acting up. I can't have you doing this kind of stuff. Now it's flipped. It's almost like the federal government now is doing a lot of this stuff. And you'll see state governments, and depending on the place, being like, hey, feds, you guys are going too far. What are you doing? And, seeing that, it reminds me, as you kind of alluded to earlier, is that the energy that we see that was being pushed against in this movie has gone away. It might have been suppressed for a while and so forth, but it hasn't gone away. And it may be on the ascent right now. And so people who thought that this was gone and we no longer have to stand united against this type of action, this type of oppression by a government, whatever government it is, a state government or a federal government, people who thought that we were done, kick our feet up, we don't have to worry about that anymore, they may have been mistaken. It may require an ongoing effort to ensure things like freedom, to ensure that the government doesn't overextend, whatever government, again, state government, local government, or whatever. Did you notice that as far as, what did you think? Or I guess, I say that to you now. What do you think about that in terms of how, whether it's a state government or a federal government, it seems like it may be an ongoing effort always for people who want to be free to make sure that their government doesn't start creeping and pushing in a way that'll take away those freedoms.
Yeah, it's a great point. And as you ended that comment, I'm going to stay on this creeping and pushing thing because it actually ties in to another part of the film and the discussion, because it's kind of both ways. And I think that's where, whoever kind of owns the narrative to the general public may be the one that wins that battle. So my example is this idea of a slippery slope. And you're right. One of the things that I know we've discussed, in recent years, watching just everything, is that there's no finish line to a democracy.
Yeah.
Like you and I were raised post civil rights era. We're born in the 70s. So we grew up in a country that was kind of opening up for everybody, right? Maybe civil rights, kind of the headlines was first, integration and Black Americans and all that. But part of that under a current was immigration changed, right? So all these immigrants benefited from the hard work of people like Martin Luther King during the civil rights era, right? Because prior to 1965, the laws were like we see the rhetoric now of wanting to only welcome immigrants from certain parts of the world, generally parts of the world where people don't look like you and I. That changed. So you have the influx of South American.
As a result of the civil rights movement, that changed.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. So and a lot of immigrants and their descendants today don't appreciate that, right? And those are the things that we're on a slippery slope of going away. Think about feminism. Think about gay rights. Think about a lot of these things that came after the heavy lifting of all the people, like Martin Luther King and those in the South. Like you said, people got beaten, lynched. The other thing I want to say, James, is this is why I think there's a strong portion of energy that has always been there that tries to keep this history hidden from all Americans. This isn't Black history. This is American history.
Yeah.
And what happens is by hiding this history, you can hide the fact that this country has only been a democracy for the last 61 years. And prior to that, it had a quasi version of fascism or a legal caste system. And the reason why I say that,
at least in many states, at least
in many states. And in other states, I mean, even where, let's say in the northern states, there were still things like redlining and housing discrimination, even though it might not have been
that's
legal
economic,
statutes.
though. It's to your point. That's an economic type of thing versus a political access to the political system thing. But to your point, it wasn't open in the way that we live it in the last 20
Correct,
years.
in the way we appreciate it now. And so in the film, there was an exchange between George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama at the time, and Lyndon Johnson. And I appreciated kind of the honesty that the filmmakers, I think, just did with this conversation, because LBJ says to Governor Wallace, he's kind of frustrated at him for always trying to gum up the works with the voting rights stuff. And he says, George, why don't you just let the in vote? And I appreciated that because, let's not soften it. They did talk like that back then. A lot of people still talk like that today. But and George Wallace comes with the whole slippery slope thing. Well, if you let them vote first, then they're going to do this. Then they're going to want to go to school with us. Then they're going to want to do that. And it's kind of the same thing. Like, it's always this fear, and it's this fear about, well, if we let them in, then, somehow it's going to muddy the water. It's all this stuff. And I think this is the problem for American culture. We got to somehow figure out how to get through this, but we have a portion of our country that doesn't want to ever address it.
It creates this dissonance also because this is a country that's founded on the principle of all men are created equal, and so it's like people are constantly some people are constantly trying to work around that, and it's like, because it'd be one thing if it wasn't founded on that, if that wasn't one of the defining things at the founding of the country. And so I think and similar to your point, let's look at, I thought the interactions between the political leaders and how they're balancing political considerations with moral considerations, LBJ in particular, and how he had to get to this point in large part because, he's talking to Wallace like, yo, why can't you just let them vote? Because he's like, you're creating all this pressure on me because you guys are over here putting hands on people. And it's all in the, I want to talk about the media here in a second, and it's all in the papers. And so people are protesting in my front yard because you guys are beating on people. And why can't you just let them vote? What's going on? And so, that's a political calculation for him more than anything, and so, but the other thing I wanted to mention here is that, and again, it goes back to the point I was saying before, is that the movie shows us, but doesn't focus on it as much. But there were plenty of people at the time, when they are beating people on the Pettus Bridge that are there cheering it on. And then there's plenty of people that were excusing it as well. And, I think that we can't forget as a society, people who have a certain moral compass, the people who believe that all men are created equal and they should be treated that way under the law. I think sometimes that we get fooled into thinking that there aren't people who, they may not talk about it, from the highest hill. Some of them might talk about it from the highest hill, but they don't have a problem with this. If a government agent shoots somebody, then they may not have a bigger problem. You may think that there's a problem with that, but they may not. And those folks will be here. There are people like that, and they are here. They will be here. But I think they are a minority of people, and so our democratic society has a way to deal with that. But we have to remember that, when it comes time to vote, we have to stop forgetting that, hey, like, people who may use coded words at certain times, but what they're trying to bring about and the means they're willing to use to bring it about may be something that, from a moral standpoint, that most Americans wouldn't stand for. And then, we forget that, and then it starts happening to us, and we're like, oh my God, how did this happen? And it's like, well, we got to believe people when they say it or when they start talking in code and so forth. So, and the other thing about it, this isn't, as you said, this is American history. This isn't Black history only, because this same type of energy, the same type of people that, it's like, okay, yeah, they'll talk in code to you, or they say, hey, I just don't like them. But, besides that, I think everybody's cool. They're not your friend anyway, because as we saw in the movie, as soon as any white people would stand with the Black folks and say, hey, yeah, we need equality in this country, they're starting to get lynched and murdered and so forth. And the movie makes that point. And in fact, the thing that actually triggered Johnson to step in, like, look, this has to stop, was when a white guy, a priest from Boston, gets murdered by the Jim Crow guys down in the South. And it's like, now, that wasn't, that, as far as we know, that wasn't the government officials that did it. That was, people roaming the streets at night. But nonetheless, it's just, there are people, you can't project your own view that, hey, everybody should have a shot. Everybody should be able to make their way. If you're a person that thinks like that, you really can't project that onto everybody else. There are many people like that. Most of us, in my mind, are like that. But there are people who aren't. And when people aren't like that, unless you're willing to go down that path with them fully, you got to be careful when it comes time to vote, when it comes time to show who you support and so forth, because it's hard to have it both ways, where it's like, hey, we're going to be super mean just to these people, though, but everybody else, y'all are cool, what I'm saying? Because we're going to be super mean to those people. Then it's going to become super mean to this people. Then it's going to be super mean to those people. And that's how we see that progression in society. And it's not like you're going to get to a point where there's just no people like that. There just are, and so those types of people need deterrence in place. Those people were tamped down because there was enough deterrence in place in our law society to keep them from going and killing people whenever they wanted to. But that has to remain in place, or else we'll start seeing more out of control actions from government officials and, people at large, because that then starts opening up the permission from that. So I want to get to the media piece, but I want to get you, I threw a lot out. So I know you.
Yeah. No, I'll just say this, that then we move just because that was good. I think, you got me thinking, because the allusion to how people react to these things. I would say that the recent issue we've had here in January of 2026 of a federal agent shooting an American citizen dead is a bit of the chickens coming home to roost over the last 15 years or so, because it speaks to what you were saying. We have all seen, millions of us, tens of millions of Americans have seen cell phone camera videos, generally of unarmed black men being killed by police. Not all the time, but enough that we know that there's a bit of an imbalance here, right? We've all acknowledged that. Then we had issues like, the officer who sat on another man's neck for 8 minutes and killed him while the guy was handcuffed and not resisting. And we saw how even stories like that are that blatant on camera, there's still a section of this country that has to give themselves an emotional offer. He was on drugs. Oh, he was on this. Yeah. And not look at the fact that, in America, the police officer themselves is not supposed to be judge, jury, and executioner. They're just supposed to take the guy and then bring him to the judge, right?
Yeah, we got other people to do the judge, jury, executioner.
That goes back to that discussion. This is why this topic will never go away for people like you and I, because this affects people like us in our life. Who is allowed to have due process in this country?
Let me add this, because you got to connect it. And just like that, we've seen in the aftermath of the recent shooting, there have been people that have gone out of their way to defend it, to say that it's okay, to try to come up with some excuse. And then further than that, we've seen people actually cheer it on. So again,
I just wanted to talk to the other people, because I get it, like your point. Those people are going to be there, the people cheering this kind of activity and all that.
My point is that those people aren't, those people may say they're not coming for you and they're just after somebody else. They're just after an immigrant. Don't worry about but my point is that that's not really the case. Don't be fooled when they say it's all about somebody else, because that's about anybody who doesn't fall in line with them.
Yeah, that's why I think we're going to have to live through this pain and more of it. Now we have an administration that is putting federal troops in the street, and they'll do this to any American. So that's your point.
If you don't fall in line with them, you are a target at this point. So
it's a reminder that, we got to protect all of each other, or else we'll all be part of the...
Yes. The people who will want to impose their will on everyone else without regard for law or anything like that, we all have to stand against that, or else they'll pick us off one by one, so to speak. That's their objective, So... the other thing I wanted to touch on, and I know we ran a little long before, but I do want to hit it real quick, is just the role of media and technology and how that played. And we saw that play in the movie. Like a lot of the movie, we saw how, one, we had King being interviewed oftentimes. New York, they had a New York Times reporter that, I guess more so represents, kind of the print media there. And he's constantly talking to, hey, what's going on here? We see television, which is a new technology relatively at that time. And, when things get broadcast on television, when images are on the front page of the paper, or images of people getting beat and stuff like that, or video of that on television, how that played a role in the population, and how people who were uncomfortable with that, or the kind of people I'm talking about who are like, yo, this is not what it should be going on. Like, once they saw that stuff, it became something that was real to them, as opposed to maybe reading about it and having it framed to them in a way that it's not something that would really bother them. So, one of the things that actually King even brought up is that, he talked about how the need to increase political pressure was, we need to do that, and the media is needed for that, and how you need drama in order to get the news media to cover what you're doing. So, my question to you is twofold. One, just kind of what did you think of how the media and the role of the media and the new media at the time, even, like being the television at that time played? And then also I want to touch on, if we have a chance to, just kind of how that was a media environment that was, very concentrated. You had these big papers that people would read in their town. You had, 3 television networks, and, one of them has this on, the other was probably going to have it on too, because there's only 3. With the ability to influence public opinion at large, again, not segments, but just public opinion at large, does that even exist anymore, with the fragmented media? So either direction, but I want your thoughts on this.
I don't know. I think we're living through the kind of sausage making period of how, with this fractured media landscape, someone will begin to control a narrative. And so I do think that we're not there yet. I think it's being attempted. That's what we're seeing with these fights over TikTok and Paramount and CBS and all these things. I think because prior to that, the answer is yes. In the 1960s, there was a very again, hierarchical media structure where there was only so many broadcasters that could broadcast television shows, and there was only so many stations. And so most Americans, 80% of the country was dialed into the same 3 or 4 news channels every night. So yes, when they saw people marching in the early to mid 1960s, and then they saw the images of the way the Southern leadership handled this. So sicking dogs on people, the fire hoses, the beatings in public. Yeah, I think that swayed public opinion. And I want to say this, James, because I was thinking about this in preparing for the show. I think it's important to recognize where we were as a country and a culture in the 1960s. Remember, we had just come off, basically 20 years prior to this, was us winning World War II. We beat fascism. We beat the Nazis. We had a certain pride of being the people that came out of these ashes, and the kind of democracy won that war. And so I think there was some
particularly the people that were coming of age during that 1940s, 30s, and 40s period were now the people who were decision makers.
Correct. And leaders in society. So people who served in the war, people that had been to Europe and saw what had happened, some of the both black and white American GIs that freed the concentration camps. So what I'm saying is, there's people in the country that understood that this kind of stuff always will just lead to more pain and ruin. So I think that you had there was a bit of it was a fight for American cultural pride too. Like, who are we? Are we going to be like the Nazis who we just beat and who behaved the way that some of these Southerners are behaving? Yeah. Or are we going to be better than that?
Yeah. And
so,
no, that's a really good point as far as why the images may have been able to influence a larger part of the American population. Like the people that were seeing those, the 40-year-old, 45-year-old, in 1965 was like, we just was trying to put this stuff down. That's a really interesting point. I'll say the change in technology, I think, is interesting, or the newer technology evolution, because the status quo at the time was one where oppression was okay. Like the southern states, people have called those, operated at least towards some people in a fascist way. So there's, I think the new technology was very helpful with points that you just made in terms of changing what the status quo was at that time. So new technology seems to be very capable of dislodging status quo. So the concern would be right now that if the status quo right now has been one of a little bit more tolerance, a little bit more of, hey, everybody should get a chance to participate under the law and be protected by the law the same, and some people shouldn't be treated better under the law than others, and so forth. If that's the status quo now, then my concern is the recent change in technology may be able to be used to dislodge that status quo. And we go to something not necessarily back to what it was in 1960, but maybe something different, something that's less based on the rule of law and based on the idea that all men have to follow the law, or all men and women, all citizens of the country have to follow the law, and some can't just be above the law or do whatever they want. So that would be my concern with that. The other thing that just kind of stood out to me, and I think your point about being in the sausage making point, or the part of this, is really on point there. And that is that King talked about how, we got to make sure we have drama so that the news media will cover this. And that sounded a lot like engagement to me. It's like, well, we got to make sure that, like, the news media is not covering this stuff out of altruism. They're covering this stuff because it'll deliver eyeballs for them. And so what I think is that what we've seen up till now is that as these new tools have emerged, and these new tools, social media tools that are biased on engagement, maybe the people who want to dislodge the status quo or take things in a direction that I might not agree with, maybe they're the ones that got the jump on it and say, hey, I can use this. I know how to generate engagement, and I can make this thing happen and take it in a way that I might not agree with, me, myself personally. And it just takes a second for people who may have the greater good, or what I would consider the greater good for society in mind, to learn, like, okay, hey, yeah, we need drama in order to get this stuff picked up on for social media, for it to go viral and so forth. So us being boring but morally right isn't going to cut it. So it's like, I'm hoping that that's the sausage making that we're seeing now, is that people of good moral, more backing and good faith will come around to the idea of not just complaining about the fact that social media is all engagement based and it's dumbing down and all that, but figure out how to use these tools as they are to then try to make society a better place and a more moral place and a more fair place, a place where there's justice. So, I think that I hope that we're in the sausage making piece of that, because all of these things are tools basically. And so it's how they're used, and that's what that's what's going to determine kind of the outcome, is how these tools are used and who they're used by.
No, I think it's an accurate observation that the new technology, the tools were first used by those kind of coming over the walls or the gates of, let's say, the old order and the old way of doing things, and they disrupted it, right?
Yeah.
And part of the disruption,
with the more urgency. Of course, if you're kind of cool with the way things are, or they were at a certain time, you're not going to be the one pushing the envelope, so to speak.
Yeah. So and so I think that you're right in the sense that they struck first, and now everyone else is trying to pick up the pieces and figure it out. And that's why it is the sausage making process, because it makes me just realize, and it's sad because I know your point isn't this, but I want to say this for the audience. James's point isn't saying that people like Martin Luther King were saying, we just got to cause drama on TV in order for us to get clicks and likes. This was serious stuff. People were losing their lives. And so I think, unfortunately,
but he was saying that in order for them to show it, he said he was saying that this won't make the news if it's not something that will deliver eyeballs.
No, I get it. That's why I'm just making a point that you aren't equating him to like a social media influencer today, because the point I'm making is that the pain was real. People were getting killed and all that. And I was going to say that that's where we're at today. People have a choice to make about what recently happened in Minnesota with the federal agent killing the lady. Is that enough pain for Americans to want to go to the ballot box and start choosing different types of leaders? Or is this type of leadership going to just deliver more pain? At some point, just like what's happening with the protests in Iran or something like that, at some point, people will stop putting up with pain. It's just, how far are we going to let this go as a population? And I think that's where we're at now, the sausage making part.
And I think, and then to your point, it's also, is that enough pain for you to remember? Because if your voting isn't for another 9 months or another 2 years, then will there be so much else that's happened and so many other things that you saw that kind of disturbed you or whatever, that it's like, oh, well, I'm thinking about other stuff now, and so I think that's part of also with how fast things move. So
if the Haitians eat your cats and dogs.
I think we can wrap this from there, but overall, it was an excellent movie. It's not something that you're looking at to see a story of a long period of time. It is an episode. It's a chapter in the civil rights movement, one that was a successful chapter in getting the Voting Rights Act passed. But to see that, there's a lot of insight that you can get as far as what's going on today, and then also the road that was traveled before. So, we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk soon.